The wood of the confessional is cold, but the voice behind the screen is like ice. "Forgive me, Father, for I am about to kill a man," the stranger whispers. He doesn't know the priest is actually Kim-Joon, the legendary Mafia boss who vanished 5 years ago. Joon grips his rosary until his knuckles turn white, listening to the voice of his own former protege planning a murder. Then, the stranger says the name of the next target, Joon's only daughter. In that second, the holy man vanishes and the monster returns. Joon's eyes turn from soft to lethal as he realizes he has a choice to make. He can keep his vow of silence and let his daughter die, or he can break the seal of confession and start a blood war that will burn the city to the ground. The sun rose over the quiet suburb of San Lorenzo, but for Father Kim, the light held no warmth. He stood in the sacristy, his movements slow and deliberate as he pulled the black cassock over his shoulders. To the elderly women waiting in the pews, he was a saintly man of God. They saw the silver hair at his temples and the calm way he folded his hands, and they felt safe. They didn't see the tension in his neck or the way his eyes scanned the room for exits every time a door creaked. For 5 years, this church had been his ivory armor. The heavy silk of the ivory stole felt like a lead weight, but it was a weight he welcomed. It was better than the weight of the guns he used to carry. He adjusted his white clerical collar in the mirror. The man looking back at him had sharp, disciplined features that didn't belong in a house of peace. He looked like a wolf wearing a shepherd's skin. He stepped out into the sanctuary, the scent of incense and old wood filling his lungs. It was a far cry from the smell of gunpowder and expensive cigars that used to define his life. He moved with robotic discipline, reciting the Latin prayers with a voice that was smooth and empty. Every bow, every sign of the cross, was a calculated move in a long game of hide-and-seek. He wasn't praying to be saved. He was praying to be forgotten. During the morning service, a young man in the back row dropped a heavy book. The loud thud echoed through the stone hall. Most people didn't flinch, but Kim-Joon was already halfway into a defensive crouch before he could stop himself. His heart hammered against his ribs. His muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. He forced himself to stand straight, his face remaining a mass of stone. He offered a small, fake smile to the congregation, but his fingers gripped the edge of the altar until his knuckles turned white. The quiet life was a lie, and he knew it. He spent his days hearing about the small sins of the neighborhood, stolen bread, white lies, and angry words. He nodded and gave penance, all while his mind mapped out the city's smuggling routes and hit zones. He was a predator in a cage of his own making, waiting for a day he hoped would never come. He lived in the silence, but the silence was getting louder. Every day he wore the cassock. He felt the monster underneath getting hungrier. He was safe for now. But in the underworld, the past is a way of finding its own light. For Father Kim, the armor was starting to feel very thin. The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass of St. Jude's, casting long, bloody streaks of red across the floor of the confessional. Father Kim sat behind the wooden screen, his back straight and his hands resting on his knees. The silence was a sanctuary, until the heavy velvet curtain moved and the smell of expensive cigarettes and street grime filled the small space. "Forgive me, Father," a voice rasped. It was a voice Kim-Joon hadn't heard in 5 years, but he recognized the arrogant tilt of it instantly. It was Woo-suk, the man he had once mentored, the man who had helped dismantle his empire. "I am listening, my son," Joon replied. He kept his tone soft and hollow, the voice of a man who had never seen blood. "I'm not here for mercy," Woo-suk sneered through the lattice. "I'm here to gloat. Tonight, the city changed his hand for good. We found the ghost boss. He's been hiding like a rat, and we're going to burn him out. By midnight, he'll be dead, and I'll be the one holding the crown." Joon's heart didn't race. It slowed down, his internal system switching from priest to executioner. He sat perfectly still, but his eyes narrowed in the dark. Woo-suk leaned closer to the screen, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "But that's not the best part. He has a daughter, a little secret he thought he could keep safe. I'm going to make him watch while I take her life first. It's the only way to make sure a ghost stays dead." Woo-suk laughed, a short, ugly sound, and then he recited an address. Joon's knuckles turned white. It was the exact location of the hidden home where his daughter, Hannah, lived under a false name. Say a prayer for them, Father. Woo-suk said, the sound of the curtain sliding back signaling his departure. They're going to need it. The confessional grew deathly quiet. June didn't move for a long minute. The safe house he had built for himself was gone. The church, with its incense and its prayers, was no longer a shield. It was a target. The ivory armor had shattered. He stood up, his movements no longer slow or robotic, but fluid and dangerous. He didn't look like a man of God anymore. He looked like a man who had just been given a reason to kill. He reached up and unbuttoned the white clerical collar, letting it fall to the floor like a discarded shackle. The wolf was out of the cage, and the city was about to remember why they had feared the ghost boss. Tonight, there would be no penance, only blood. The silence of the church, once a comfort, now felt like a suffocating shroud. Kim-Joon stood in the center of the dark sanctuary, staring at the large crucifix above the altar. For 5 years, he had tried to believe he was a new man. He had traded his black leather for a black cassock, hoping the rituals of the church would wash the iron taste of blood from his mouth. But as the echo of Woo-suk's threat vibrated in his ears, he realized that the sealed confession was a luxury he could no longer afford. A priest was supposed to forgive. A priest was supposed to pray for his enemies. But June felt no urge to pray. He felt the cold, familiar hum of adrenaline, the same predatory focus that had made him the most feared man in the underworld. He was at war with himself. One part of him wanted to kneel and beg for guidance, while the other part was already calculating the most efficient way to break Woo-suk's neck. He knew that by stepping out of this role, he was walking away from his only chance at peace. But if the price of his soul was his daughter's life, it was a price he would pay 1,000 times over. He turned away from the altar and walked toward the heavy iron door that led to the basement. His footsteps were no longer the soft, rhythmic pace of a shepherd. They were the silent, heavy strikes of a hunter. The basement was damp and smelled of dust and old wax. He pushed past crates of unused candles and stacks of hymnals until he reached the far corner. There stood a weathered, life-size statue of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. June placed his hand on the base of the statue and pressed a hidden latch. With a low, grinding sound, the pedestal slid aside, revealing a hollow compartment in the stone floor. Inside was a steel case, untouched for half a decade. He opened it, and the dim basement light glinted off the matte black finish of a customized handgun and a pair of tactical gloves. Tucked into the side of the case was a burner phone. He powered it on, the small screen illuminating his face in a harsh, ghostly blue. He looked at the device, then at the ivory stole still draped around his neck. The duality was a bitter poison. He reached down and gripped the cold steel of the weapon, the weight of it feeling more natural in his hand than any rosary ever had. He didn't need a miracle tonight. He needed a monster. As he tucked the phone and the weapon into the hidden pockets of his cassock, the transformation was complete. The seal was broken. The sword was drawn. The ghost boss was back, and he was coming for everything they had taken from him. The night air was cold, biting to the thin fabric of the priest's shirt that Kim-Joon wore beneath a heavy, dark coat. He moved through the narrow alleyways of the city, like a shadow returning to its source. The robotic discipline of the parish was gone, replaced by the fluid, silent grace of a predator. He was no longer Father Kim. He was a ghost, and the streets remembered his footsteps. He tracked the first hitman to a dim street corner 3 blocks away from his daughter's apartment. The man was young, dressed in a nondescript hoodie, leaning against a lamppost while checking a suppressed pistol in his pocket. He was sloppy, a low-level soldier Woo-suk had sent to do the dirty work. To June, the boy looked like an amateur playing a deadly game. June knew he couldn't just put a bullet in the boy's head. A dead hitman outside a quiet apartment complex would bring the police and more heat than he could handle. He needed divine intervention. He needed a miracle that looked like a tragedy. He watched as the hitman began to move toward the building's entrance. June slipped ahead, moving with a speed that defied his age. Near the entrance sat a heavy, rusted metal scaffolding used for building repairs. With a pair of wire cutters from his tactical kit, June snipped the tension cables at the base. It was precise work, calculated down to the inch. As the hitman stepped onto the sidewalk directly beneath the structure, June kicked the final support beam. There was no scream, only the sudden, violent crash of twisting metal and falling planks. The scaffolding collapsed in a deafening heap, pinning the hitman's legs and arm beneath a ton of iron. The boy howled in pain, his gun sliding across the pavement and into a sewer grate. June stepped out of the shadows for just a moment, keeping his face hidden in the darkness of his hood. He looked down at the trapped man, whose eyes were wide with terror and shock. To the hitman, it looked like a freak accident, an act of God. June didn't say a word. He didn't offer a prayer. He simply picked up a discarded brick and tossed it near the man's head, a silent warning that the shadows were watching. By the time the sirens began to wail in the distance, June was already gone. He had neutralized the first threat without spilling a drop of blood that could be traced back to a priest. As he walked back toward the church, he felt the cold steel of the burner phone vibrate in his pocket. The war had officially started, and while the world saw an accident, the underworld was about to feel a haunting. The ghost was no longer just watching. He was intervening. The street where Hannah lived was lined with cherry blossoms, a peaceful corner of the world that smelled of rain and fresh beginnings. Kim-Joon stood in the deep shadows of a bus stop across the street, his face buried in the high collar of his coat. He watched his daughter through the glass of a small cafe window. She was laughing, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear as she studied for her university exams. To her, the world was a place of books and bright futures. To her, her father was a ghost who had died in a tragic accident 5 years ago. Seeing her sent a sharp, physical pain through June's chest. He wanted to cross the street, pull her into his arms, and tell her that he was alive. But he knew that the moment he stepped into the light, her peace would vanish. He wasn't a father anymore. He was a target. His eyes moved from Hannah to a black sedan parked at the end of the block. The windows were tinted too dark for a student neighborhood. As Hannah packed her bag and stood up to leave, the car's engine hummed to life. 2 men in suits sat inside, their eyes fixed on her every move. June's blood ran cold. Woo-suk wasn't just planning. He was already closing in. Hannah stepped out onto the sidewalk, blissfully unaware of the wolves at her back. As she turned toward her apartment, the sedan began to creep forward, keeping pace with her footsteps. June knew the play. They were waiting for her to hit the dimly lit stretch of road near the park. He couldn't let them touch her, but he couldn't let her see him. If she saw his face, the lie that kept her safe would shatter. June moved. He didn't follow her. He cut through the back alley, moving with the terrifying speed of a man half his age. He found a stack of heavy wooden pallets leaning against a brick wall. As the sedan rounded the corner, June waited for the perfect second. Just as the car accelerated to cut her off, he shoved the stack into the street. The wood exploded against the sedan's front tire with a violent thud. The car swerved, its rim grinding against the pavement with a shower of sparks. Hannah jumped, spinning around in fright, but all she saw was a pile of fallen debris and a broken car. June pulled his hood lower, staying deep in the darkness of the alley. He watched her run the final few yards to her building, her breath visible in the cold air. The men in the car were cursing, struggling to open their jammed doors. June let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. She was safe for another hour, another night. But as he turned back toward the church, his grip tightened on the hidden gun in his pocket. The ghost was done watching. It was time to start hunting. The following morning, the smell of incense in the sanctuary was choked out by the heavy, expensive scent of Woo-suk's cologne. He didn't come to the confessional this time. He walked straight down the center aisle of the church, his polished leather shoes clicking against the stone floor like a countdown. He wore a sharp, charcoal suit and a smirk that suggested he owned the sun, the moon, and the ground Kim-Joon stood on. June stood by the altar, his hands tucked into the wide sleeves of his cassock. His posture was perfect, the image of a humble servant. But beneath the black cloth, his muscles were coiled like a viper. "Father," Woo-suk said, stopping just inches from the altar rail, "I'm embarking on a major business venture tonight, a final acquisition. I thought it might be wise to get a blessing from a man of God. Just in case things get messy." June looked down at him. The urge to reach across the railing and crush the younger man's throat was so strong it made his teeth ache. He could see the bulge of a shoulder holster beneath Woo-suk's jacket. He could see the arrogance in the way the man didn't even bother to take off his sunglasses in the house of the Lord. The Lord watches over all who seek him, Joon said, his voice a low, steady hum. He picked up the heavy brass vessel of holy water. But a blessing cannot wash away a heart that is already black with intent. Woo-suk laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the empty rafters. My heart is just fine, Father. It's my enemies whose hearts are about to stop beating. He leaned over the rail, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The ghost boss. I'm going to end his legend tonight. And then I'm going to find his little girl. I'll send her to heaven so she can tell him hi. Joon felt the world turn cold. He dipped his thumb into the holy water and stepped forward. He pressed his damp thumb against Woo-suk's forehead, the gesture looking like a blessing but feeling like a marking. He stared directly into Woo-suk's eyes, dropping the Father Kim mask for a fraction of a second. The gaze he leveled at his enemy was so sharp, so ancient and predatory, that Woo-suk actually flinched. May you receive exactly what you deserve, Joon whispered. For a moment, the air between them was thick with gunpowder and unspoken threats. Woo-suk frowned, a flicker of confusion and sudden fear crossing his face. He stepped back, straightening his tie as if trying to regain his composure. He didn't understand why a simple priest made his skin crawl, but he didn't stay to find out. As Woo-suk turned and hurried out of the church, Joon wiped his thumb on his cassock. He watched the heavy oak doors swing shut. The blessing was over. The hunt had begun. Joon didn't need to pray anymore. He knew exactly where the wolves were going, and he would be there waiting in the dark. The following evening, the church was bathed in the flickering orange light of 100 prayer candles. Kim-Joon stood in the shadows of the choir loft, his eyes fixed on the young deacon, Mateo. Mateo was a local boy, or so everyone thought. He was helpful, quiet, and always the first to arrive to prepare the incense. But tonight, Joon had seen something that didn't belong in a house of God. While cleaning the altar, Mateo had pulled a high-end, encrypted radio from his robes. He had whispered into it, giving a detailed report of the church's security and Joon's daily schedule. The boy wasn't serving the Lord. He was a spy for Woo-suk. He was a Judas who had sold out the sanctuary for a handful of syndicate silver. Joon didn't call the police. He didn't raise his voice. He simply waited until the church was empty and the heavy oak doors were locked. He found Mateo in the sacristy, folding the white altar cloths with practiced, lying hands. The Bible says that the truth will set you free, Mateo, Joon said, his voice echoing like a tolling bell. The boy jumped, dropping the cloth. He tried to smile, but his eyes darted toward the door. Father Kim, you startled me. I was just finishing up. Joon stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing his ivory stole. He was wearing the black leather gloves from the basement. He placed a heavy, scarred hand on Mateo's shoulder. The pressure was enough to make the boy's knees buckle. I know who you serve, Joon whispered, his face inches from the spies. And I know what you told them. You brought the stench of the streets into my home. Joon dragged the shaking boy toward the large baptismal font. He didn't use violence, not yet. He simply showed him the burner phone he had recovered from the boy's locker. I am going to excommunicate you, Mateo, but not from the church. From the living. Joon didn't kill him. Instead, he forced the boy to record a final message to Woo-suk. Under the cold stare of the ghost boss, Mateo sobbed into the radio, confessing that he had been caught and that the priest was coming for them all. Joon then took the boy's radio and crushed it under his boot. He handed Mateo a bus ticket and a small bag of silver coins. Run. If I ever see your face in the city again, I won't be a priest. I will be the man who put your boss in the ground. As the boy fled into the night, terrified and broken, Joon knew the message would reach Woo-suk. The Judas was gone, and in his place, a warning had been sent. The sanctuary was no longer a place of peace. It was a fortress, and the ghost boss was finally ready to tear the underworld apart. The rain drummed against the stained glass windows of the cathedral like a hail of bullets. Kim-Joon stood at the pulpit, his face a mask of holy sorrow as he looked down at the polished mahogany casket. Inside lay a man he had once called a brother, an associate who had been gunned down in a drive-by just 2 days prior. But June wasn't looking at the dead. He was looking at the living. The front pews were filled with the monsters of the city. Men in silk suits and heavy rings sat with bowed heads, pretending to pray. Woo-suk sat in the center, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, a smug smirk playing on his lips. They all thought they were safe in the house of God. They thought the man in the black robes was just a harmless priest who didn't know their names. June opened a heavy leather Bible, but he didn't read the verses. He looked directly at the Council of Generals, the men who betrayed him 5 years ago. "We are gathered here to speak of the end." June began, his voice deep and resonant, vibrating through the stone hall. "Many of you believe that death is a door that closes. You believe that your secrets are buried with the fallen. But I tell you today, judgment does not wait for the afterlife. It is walking among you now." A cold shiver seemed to pass through the pews. Woo-suk shifted in his seat, a flicker of unease crossing his face. June's eyes moved like a predator's, locking onto each man one by one. To the congregation, it looked like a priest offering comfort. To the targets, it was a silent promise of execution. He was marking them: the money launderer in the third row, the hitman by the door, and the traitor in the front. "The Lord says that what is done in the dark will be brought to the light." June continued, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "You have built your kingdoms on blood and lies. You think you are kings, but you are merely sheep waiting for the shearer. Enjoy your peace while the candles still burn. For some of you, this is the last time you will hear a bell toll." He closed the Bible with a loud thud that echoed like a gunshot. The Mafia elite stood up, many of them looking pale and glancing over their shoulders. As they filed out of the church, stepping back into the rain, they felt a weight they couldn't explain. June stood at the altar, watching them leave. He had given them their final rites. The funeral was for his associate, but as he watched Woo-suk disappear into a black sedan, June knew the next graves would be much deeper. The sermon was over. The massacre was about to begin. In the quiet of the night, Kim-Joon sat in the dim light of the church rectory, but he wasn't reading scripture. Before him lay a ledger of secrets, names, dates, and sins whispered through the wooden screen of the confessional over 5 long years. He had never used this information for leverage, but now, these secrets were the only weapons he had left. To save his daughter and burn Woo-suk's world, he had to play the devil to do God's work. The first domino fell with a single, anonymous phone call. June leaked the location of a hidden warehouse to the Dragon Head Triad, a group that had been looking for an excuse to reclaim territory from Woo-suk. By midnight, the docks were a symphony of gunfire and burning rubber. While the two gangs tore at each other's throats, June watched the news from the shadows, his face as cold as a statue. He wasn't just starting a fight. He was amputating Woo-suk's limbs. Next, he sent a cryptic message to a corrupt police captain who had spent years on the syndicate's payroll. The message contained a ledger of the captain's secret offshore accounts, proof that June had gathered from a repentant accountant months ago. Terrified of life behind bars, the captain panicked. Instead of protecting Woo-suk's smuggling routes, he ordered a massive raid, seizing millions in contraband. Woo-suk's treasury was bleeding out, and the king was losing his grip on the crown. By the third day, the city was a war zone. Rival lieutenants who had once stood side by side were now pointing guns at each other's heads. June had whispered the truth about a secret affair to one and a hidden betrayal to another. Trust, the only currency the underworld had, was now worthless. Every time a bomb went off or a car was peppered with bullets, the pressure on Woo-suk grew. June moved through the parish during the day with the same robotic discipline, offering prayers for peace to the terrified locals. But at night, he returned to his burner phone, directing the chaos with the precision of a master conductor. He was weakening the foundation of the house, so that when he finally stepped inside, the ceiling would collapse. Woo-suk was surrounded by fire, and the most terrifying part was that he still didn't know who had lit the match. The sins of the city had come home to roost, and Kim-Joon was the one holding the door open. The storm hit the city with vengeance, rain lashing against the stone walls of the church like a warning. Inside, Kim-Joon stood before the altar, the orange glow of the candles dancing in his dark eyes. He had known this moment was coming. The chaos he had sown in the streets had worked too well. stripping away Woo-suk's men until only the most desperate remained. And a desperate wolf always returns to where it was first wounded. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they exploded inward. The sound of splintering would drown out the thunder. Woo-suk stepped into the sanctuary, his expensive suit soaked and his face twisted in a mask of pure, murderous realization. Behind him, 10 gunmen fanned out, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the floor. "You!" Woo-suk spat, his voice trembling with rage. "All this time, I was confessing my sins to a corpse. I should have known a man like you couldn't stay in the ground." Joon didn't flinch. He slowly reached into the folds of his black cassock and pulled out the matte black handgun. The movement was so smooth, so practiced, that the gunman hesitated. "I offered you peace, Woo-suk," Joon said, his voice as calm as the eye of the storm. "I gave you a blessing, but you chose to bring blood into my house." "This isn't a house anymore," Woo-suk screamed. "It's your tomb. Kill him." Gunfire erupted, the deafening cracks echoing to the high rafters and shattering the stained glass windows into a million colored diamonds. Joon dug behind the heavy marble pulpit as stone chips sprayed into the air. He didn't fire back wildly. He was a ghost, a legend, and he moved like one. He popped up, fired 2 precise shots, and 2 of Woo-suk's men collapsed before they could even scream. The sanctuary, a place built for whispers and prayers, became a slaughterhouse. Joon moved between the pews, using the shadows he knew so well. He dropped a 3rd man near the baptismal font, the water turning a dark, sickly red. Every shot Joon took was a period at the end of the sentence. He wasn't just defending a building. He was protecting the secret that kept his daughter alive. Woo-suk scrambled backward, his arrogance replaced by a primal fear. He realized too late that he hadn't trapped a priest. He had locked himself in a room with a monster. The incense was replaced by the stinging smell of gunpowder. One by one, Woo-suk's shadows went silent. As the last of the gunmen fell, the church grew deathly quiet, save for the heavy rain and the sound of Woo-suk's frantic breathing. Joon stepped out into the center aisle, his cassock torn and his face splattered with red. He looked at the altar, then at the man who had tried to take everything. The battle for the sanctuary was over, but the war for the city had just reached its final, bloodiest hour. The wind howled to the open arches of the bell tower, bringing the scent of rain and gunpowder with it. Kim-Joon stood at the top of the stone stairs, his silhouette sharp against the lightning-streaked sky. He had finally shed the black cassock, leaving it crumpled on the altar below. Now, he wore a simple dark tactical jacket, his shoulders broad and his movements unburdened. The priest was dead. The boss was back. Woo-suk backed away toward the edge of the tower, his hand trembling as he pointed his empty pistol at Joon's chest. The younger man was gasping for air, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at Joon and didn't see a man of God. He saw a ghost that had come to reclaim its throne. "Stay back!" Woo-suk screamed over the roar of the thunder. "I ran the city for 5 years. You were nothing but a memory." Joon continued to walk forward, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the stone floor. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of his presence was enough to pin Woo-suk against the cold iron of the massive church bell. "You sat in my confessional and told me your sins," Joon said, his voice cutting to the wind like a blade. "You bragged about the blood you spilled and the family you planned to destroy. You thought God was listening, Woo-suk, but it was just me." Joon stopped 3 feet away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver crucifix, the one he had carried as a priest. He tossed it at Woo-suk's feet. "I am going to give you one last chance for absolution," Joon whispered, his eyes as cold as the depth of the ocean. "Confess, not to a priest, but to the man you betrayed. Tell me why you thought you could touch my daughter." Woo-suk looked down at the crucifix, then back at Joon. He tried to speak, but only a choked sob came out. He knew there was no mercy left in this world for him. He had brought the war to a man who had mastered it. I just wanted to be you," Woo-suk whimpered, collapsing to his knees. "I wanted the power. I wanted everyone to fear me the way they feared the ghost." Joon looked down at him, a mixture of pity and steel. "Power is a burden, not a prize. And fear is a fire that eventually burns the one who lights it. Joon raised his hand. There was no hesitation, no prayer, and no anger, only the cold efficiency of a man finishing a job. "Your confession is heard," Joon said. "Now it's time to meet your maker." The bell tolled once, a deep, mournful sound that swallowed the final crack of the night. When the vibration stopped, only the wind remained. The ghost boss stood alone in the tower, looking out over the city he had once ruled and had now saved. The final absolution was complete. The smoke from the fire had long since cleared, but the air around the old cathedral still tasted of iron and ash. Kim-Joon stood on the steps of the church one last time, watching the first light of dawn creep over the city skyline. The sirens in the distance were fading. Woo-suk was gone, and the syndicate that terrorized the streets had been torn apart from the inside. The war was over, but the man who had ended it was no longer the same. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, but they were no longer the hands of a priest. He knew he could never go back to the altar. He could not preach about mercy when he had spent the night delivering judgment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small brass key to the rectory, placing it quietly on the stone ledge. He was leaving the sanctuary behind, but he wasn't going back to the throne either. The underworld was a vacuum now, and many would try to fill it, but Joon had a different plan. He would not be a king who ruled through fear, nor a priest who ruled through prayer. He would be the ghost that lived in the middle. He would be the guardian of the city, a shadow that watched in the dark to make sure no new monster ever rose high enough to threaten the innocent. He took a bus to the edge of the university district. He stood behind the same cherry blossom tree he had visited nights before. He watched Hannah walk out her apartment, a coffee in her hand and a backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked peaceful. She looked safe. She didn't know that the storm had almost reached her door, or that her father had burned a kingdom to the ground to keep her smiling. Joon pulled his cap low over his eyes as she walked past him. For a split second, she slowed down, her brow furrowed as if she recognized the scent of his old cologne or the rhythm of his breath. But she didn't stop. She kept walking toward her future, a future paid for in blood and silence. Joon turned away and disappeared into the morning crowd. He had no home and no name, but he had a purpose. He would walk the thin line between heaven and hell, watching over the city and the daughter he loved from afar. The new kingdom wasn't a palace or a parish. It was a promise. And as long as the ghost boss was breathing, the war would never return to her door. The wolf was still out there, not to hunt, but to guard the fold.